right, so next we have Jack, who's going to talk about how he keeps everything in his plot. What he
More or less. Mine's a little specialized, and I'll focus on the browns that complement the greens that are part of composting. So I'm going to focus on using dry leaves, stems, and tree branches, not only to feed the soil, but to shelter pollinators. Next slide, please. So dead woody material, the sources of carbon in compost, those are the branches, the twigs, the leaves. They also provide abundant habitat for pollinators, and we'll be talking about the pollinators in the next few slides. And how you arrange those dead branches, twigs, or leaves in your garden is up to you. It can be neat and tidy. That's why I have no or yes. Or it can be, you know, you make a pile, as Jerome was showing, in one corner of the garden. It's entirely up to you in terms of aesthetics. But I want to make a pitch here for using the fall leaves that are so abundant from the surrounding oak trees and maple trees around the gardens for a natural mulch to recycle what nature is producing back into the cycle of nutrients for the soil and your plants. So again, fall leaves are, you know, I gather them up from the garden paths and put about a 1 or 2 inch layer on my garden every fall. And most of that is broken down by spring. If not, it'll break down by the summer. Mm-hmm. So the leaves really insulate the soil, hold the water in, and also controls temperatures during extremes in the winter. But mainly it feeds the microorganisms, the insects, the fungi that do the work of decomposing the leaves into soil nutrients, thereby feeding your plants. So the concept is to feed the soil. The soil is what feeds your plants. So we're always thinking about feeding the soil. So if you'll leave piles of twigs, branches, logs in your garden, it's going to feed the soil, and it's also going to help the pollinators. So next slide, we'll start talking about the pollinators. So bees are the most prevalent pollinators, followed by flies and then butterflies. So most people think about the butterflies, but it's the bees and the flies that do the heavy pollinating. So there are 2 types of bees. They're above ground and below ground. And in this slide, we show you the above ground, which account for about 30% of the bee population, the native bee population. These are cavity nesting bees. And to your right, you see in the oval a mason bee, which is about the size of a honeybee. And below her is a dried stem that she has laid eggs in, and they've turned into larvae. And you see on the far right a pupa that is going to emerge soon as an adult mason bee. And they are also pollinator bees. So these dead, it's good for you to leave the dead stems intact over the winter and into the summer. And I'll give you a little bit of a description of how to do that in just a moment. Some people want to know the difference between carpenter bees, the other above ground bee, and bumblebees, because they're about the same size and they look very similar. The key is the abdomen of the carpenter bee is shiny, whereas the bumblebee abdomen is hairy. Okay, next slide. Now let's talk about bees below ground, which is about 70% of the native bees. Those include the bumblebee that I showed in the other slide. So they emerge early in the spring. They pollinate fruit trees, spring ephemerals like spring beauties and bloodroot, and flowering shrubs. So in March, when you see in your garden a big bumblebee, then that is the queen bee who has emerged early to begin feeding, to lay her eggs and feed the larvae that will develop below ground. So access to bare ground is essential for these cavity living bees or ground living bees. So the main thing to remember is to not use wood chips for that area, because wood chips are too heavy and thick for the bees to penetrate. So either bare ground or use leaves to cover the ground so they can access it. There are also miner bees, M-I-N-E-R, and there's one in the lower left corner. They're very small. They're like 1/4 of an inch or smaller, and they do a lot of burrowing also. And to the right is a demonstration of the brood chambers for a miner bee. Next slide, please. I only have 5 minutes, that's why I'm going so fast. So how to create habitat for stem nesting bees. Thanks to Julia for finding this wonderful graphic. So on the left, let's start and just follow the arrows. In the winter, you leave your dead flower stalks intact over the winter. Then in the spring, cut back some of the flower stalks to allow some open stems for the female bees find and lay their eggs, which you see on the right side of that upper right spring graphic. Down in summer, you have stems, and then the bee larvae are developing over in the cut stems. And then in the fall and the winter, the bees are hibernating in the stems during the winter, and then in the spring, you'll have the adult bees emerge and the cycle begins again. Now, you may have a question about what are good stem bee homes. Which plants are best for this? They're pithy stems like raspberry, Joe pieweed, hydrangea, and native grasses like switchgrass and little and yeah. So those are wonderful things to have in your garden if you don't already have them there. Last slide, please.
And before you go on, if you guys are not talking, if you can mute yourself, then we don't get background noise. And then when you're talking, if you can unmute, that would be awesome.
Yes, thank you for the belch that someone contributed. So the last slide, Isha, is just a thank you. You see down below in that slide, I have circled a Fowler's toad that's in my garden that's eating the insects that are in my little compost pile. So shout out to Jerome for those garden compost piles. So thank you, and any questions you have, I'll try to answer.
See who has questions. I loved the picture of the little your little toad there. It was really
thank you.
Hidden, and I wouldn't have noticed if you didn't have the yellow circle on it. It's the camouflage.
Yeah, very well
so
concealed.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I had no idea. I had no idea that bees burrowed underground. That's really interesting and good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, 70% of them, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So
Yeah,
if
actually,
you have any questions, feel free to unmute and ask some questions of Jack.
I've left them speechless.
Yeah, it sounds like you answered everything all in one, so it was perfect. I like how your pictures in the beginning, it's so attractive, the way that you've used the dry stems and everything and kind of grouped them together. I thought that was really pretty.
Yeah.
Okay.
If some of you grow black-eyed Susans or Rudbeckia, those are wonderful. I have a picture of those in there. Great in the winter. The blackheads are really graphic and quite beautiful in winter gardens.
I think somebody had a question.
Question. Will you help remind us when is a good time to actually do some of the little techniques that you are recommending in terms of like what's happening in spring and what's happening in fall? That's sometimes helpful to be reminded. This is a time to collect and put it at, at certain places. I would love to get that kind of reminder.
That's a great idea. I'm happy to do that. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question, Jack. So,
yes.
In my garden, I have, I have some rudbeckia, and I also have some coneflower, and through discussions, I've left them over the winter. So is there a particular time, like what Karen was asking, like right now, is it a good time to start clipping those down? And I've been putting them off to the side, but is that all right? In other words, like if there's a larvae inside and you're clipping it and just putting it to the side of your garden, will it still germinate and then go ahead and continue the life cycle?
If you have not already cut the stems from before,
right? Yeah, I had.
Have not.
No.
Okay, so don't cut them now. Wait until late fall, early winter to cut those to allow the bee to go in there and start the process. So you're right at the beginning of the cycle where she needs to lay her eggs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And Sally had a question. She asked, do they resemble cutworms? Is that larva?
I'm not sure about cutworms. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Could you ask more, clarify?
Sally, do you want to clarify?
Well, I just wondered if they looked kind of like cutworms, the larvae, because I don't want to be killing them. And, you know, if I'm digging them up, I don't want to be hurting them. So I'll have to look up the difference, I guess.
Yes, I think so. I'm not quite sure what the difference is. Yeah. I don't know what an adult cutworm, what does it turn into? A beetle?
Well, I'm not really sure, but they eat all the plants, so they cut all the roots. So
yeah, I
it's
think
like,
that's something different. I don't think that those are the larvae of bees or or butterflies or moths. I think those are beetles or other kind of plant destroying insects.
I'll look up the difference so that I can see what they may be. So I'm not destroying one for the other by mistake.
Yeah,
So
very
thanks.
good. Yeah.
That's what I always worry about that too, Sally, when I find larvae or bugs in my, I'm like, okay, is this something that I should kill because it's bad
Yeah.
Yeah. And just from a really quick check that I just did, we can read more, but some of those cutworms are just moth larvae.
Okay.
Sometimes they're okay to leave. So we should Google it all and study a bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.